When the heavy iron doors of the federal prison finally opened behind me after 12 long years, I didn't call my wife, and I didn't call my younger brother. I just flagged down a yellow cab and rode straight to the Connecticut estate I'd built from the ground up. I was originally supposed to serve 20 years for corporate fraud, a crime I never committed. But newly decrypted digital evidence had just cleared my name. I expected to be welcomed back by a family that had suffered and waited for me. But as I stood in my own hallway, listening to the clinking of ice cubes in a glass of whiskey, I heard the two people I loved most in the world laughing uncontrollably. They were laughing about how they'd stolen my $50 million company, drained my retirement fund, and were planning to lock me away in a nursing home if I ever got out. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just listened in absolute silence. And right then, I made a decision that would change everything. If you're listening to my story today, take a deep breath, because the kind of betrayal I'm about to tell you about is something you think only happens in the movies, until it unfolds right in your own living room. If you've ever been stabbed in the back by someone you trusted, please hit the like button and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. It lets a 70-year-old man know he isn't alone in this world. My name is Richard Caldwell. 12 years ago, my life was completely stolen from me. I was the founder and CEO of Caldwell Tech, a company I built from a tiny garage project into a massive corporate empire. I had it all. I had a brilliant younger brother named Edward, who served as my CFO, and a beautiful, supportive wife named Diana. We were a team, or at least that's what I truly believed. When federal agents raided our headquarters 12 years ago, they uncovered falsified accounting ledgers and illegal offshore wire transfers carrying my digital signature. I was completely blindsided. I went to prison proclaiming my innocence, fully believing my brother and wife would fight tooth and nail on the outside to clear my name. I spent over 4,000 days in a concrete cell, surviving on the single hope of returning to them. Today was supposed to be that day. My exoneration came completely out of nowhere. A routine audit of an old server revealed the truth about those forged signatures, leading to my immediate and quiet release. They handed me a gray paper bag containing the clothes I was arrested in, and I walked out into the free world. I didn't want a grand reception or a dramatic phone call. I just wanted to see their faces. I wanted to surprise the woman who wrote to me during those first few years before her visits slowly stopped. I wanted to hug the brother who claimed he was working day and night just to save my company. The cab dropped me off at the end of the long driveway of my Tudor-style estate in Connecticut. The autumn air was crisp. The manicured lawn looked identical to how I remembered it. I paid the driver with the last bit of cash in my wallet and walked up to the heavy oak front door. I knew my keys had been confiscated long ago, but I also knew about the spare key, hidden under a fake rock beneath a large planter on the porch. I bent down, my 70-year-old joints aching from a decade on a hard prison cot, and felt the cold metal. It was still there. I slid the key softly into the lock and turned it. The door swung open without a sound. The house smelled of expensive vanilla candles and polished wood. It was warm, inviting, and dead silent. Holding my gray paper bag, I took a slow step inside. I was about to call out their names, but a strange, heavy instinct settled in my chest. Call it the survival mechanism of a man who spent 12 years living among predators. Something just felt off. Stepping lightly down the long hallway toward the back of the house, I heard voices coming from my old study. The door was cracked open just an inch, casting a warm sliver of light across the hardwood floor. I heard the unmistakable clinking of ice hitting a crystal glass. Then, I heard his voice. It was Edward. His tone wasn't stressed or burdened, like he had claimed in his rare messages to me. He sounded relaxed, confident, almost dripping with arrogance. "The lawyer just called," Edward said, his voice echoing slightly in the spacious room. "Richard's early parole was approved today. He's officially a free man." I froze in my tracks. My heart pounded against my ribs. They knew. They already knew I was coming home. I raised my hand, ready to push the door open, announce my return, and share the relief. But before my fingers touched the wood, a second voice spoke up. It was Diana, my wife's voice. The woman whose face I stared at on the concrete ceiling every single night. "Well, that's incredibly inconvenient," Diana said. Her voice was ice cold. No joy, no relief, just pure, unadulterated annoyance. "Did you execute the wire transfer for the final $10 million from his retirement fund into the offshore account like we planned?" My hand stopped in mid-air. The air in my lungs turned to glass. I stood completely still, my ear pressed against the crack in the door. "Done," Edward replied with a soft, satisfied chuckle. "I completed the transaction an hour ago. Every trace of his liquid assets has been erased, laundered through 3 shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. The 70-year-old inmate has nothing to his name now. The company is under my complete control, and his personal accounts are completely bare." I couldn't breathe. The world spun around me. My brother, my own blood, the man I entrusted with my life's work, was casually discussing how he had drained my entire life savings. Diana let out a dark, mocking laugh that sent a cold shiver down my spine. It was a sound I had never heard from her before. "Good," she said, taking a sip of her drink. "Let him come home. What can he possibly do? He's a broken, penniless old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we'll just commit him to a cheap state nursing home. We can claim his mind deteriorated in prison, and nobody will question us. After all, we hold the power of attorney." "Precisely," Edward agreed, clinking his glass against hers. "To us, Diana, to the perfect crime and the perfect life." They were making a toast. They were standing in my study, drinking my whiskey, celebrating the complete destruction of my life. In a matter of seconds, 12 years of longing and love evaporated into thick, suffocating ash. They had known all along. They had orchestrated the entire thing from the very beginning. The pain was so sharp, so real. It felt like a blade twisting inside my chest. I wanted to collapse to the floor, to scream until my throat bled. But I didn't. Prison teaches you a brutal lesson. When you are surrounded by wolves, you cannot cry, and you cannot show weakness. You observe, and you prepare your counterattack. My hands shook, not out of fear, but out of a deep, cold hatred that went far beyond anger. As my hands trembled, the cheap gray paper bag I was holding slipped from my grip. It hit a small decorative glass vase sitting on the hallway console table. The vase tipped over and shattered against the hardwood floor. The sound of breaking glass shattered the quiet elegance of the house like a gunshot. In the study, the laughter instantly stopped. The clinking of glasses froze. A terrifying, heavy silence fell over the hallway. "Did you hear that?" Edward's voice grew tense, panic suddenly replacing his arrogance. "It might just be the wind," Diana whispered, though her voice trembled too. I didn't run. I didn't hide. I slowly raised my foot and kicked the remaining glass fragments aside. Then, I walked straight into the open doorway of the study. Edward and Diana were standing near the fireplace, their glasses frozen in mid-air. When they turned around and saw me standing there, every bit of color drained from their faces. They looked like they had just seen a ghost. And in a way, they had. The naive, trusting Richard Caldwell from 12 years ago was dead. The man standing in front of them was someone else entirely. I looked at my brother, wearing my father's watch. I looked at my wife, wearing the diamond necklace I bought her for our anniversary. I didn't shout. I didn't swing my fists. I just stood there, straight-backed, locking my eyes onto theirs with the cold, dead stare of a man who had nothing left to lose. "Hello, Edward." "Hello, Diana," I said, my voice low and disturbingly steady. "I hope I'm not interrupting your celebration." They stood frozen, staring at me in absolute terror. The rules of the game had just shifted, and they had no idea what was coming next. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. I stood in the doorway, staring at the 2 people I had spent over 4,000 nights missing. Edward and Diana remained paralyzed, the color drained from their skin. I saw pure fear in their eyes. They thought I was a ghost, but if there's one thing a survivor knows how to do, it's adapt. The shock lasted only 3 seconds before their survival instincts kicked in. Diana moved first. The cold, ruthless woman who was just plotting to lock me in a nursing home vanished instantly. Her face contorted into a mask of overwhelming emotion. She dropped her glass onto the Persian rug, spilling whiskey everywhere, and let out a dramatic gasp. Tears welled up in her eyes in an instant. She rushed across the room in her heels, throwing her arms tightly around my neck. She buried her face in my shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. "Richard," she cried, her voice trembling. "Oh my God, you're finally home." She held me tightly, but I felt absolutely nothing. The scent of her perfume tasted like poison now. A moment later, Edward snapped out of his paralysis too. He set his glass down sharply and hurried over. He grabbed my right hand, squeezing it with the desperate grip of a loving brother. His eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. "Brother," Edward choked out. "They didn't tell us. The lawyer only said parole was approved. We had no idea you'd be back today. Look at you. We missed you so much." I stood there in their suffocating embrace. If this were 12 years ago, I would have wept with joy. I would have thanked God for bringing me back to my family. But now, feeling my wife's fake tears soak into my clothes and my brother's treacherous hand gripping mine, all I felt was ice-cold rage. I let them finish their performance. Then, I slowly unclasped Diana's arms from around my neck. I withdrew my hand from Edward's grip and took a step back. The forced warmth in my face faded. "I missed you both too," I said with a dangerous calm. "But before we celebrate, I have a question. What $10 million and what Swiss account were you talking about?" Dead silence fell over the room. Diana's sobbing cut short. Edward's jaw tightened. They realized I had heard them. I watched their eyes dart back and forth, exchanging a silent message. I wanted to watch them fall to their knees and confess. But Edward was too smart for that. There was a reason he was the CFO. He was a master at damage control. He took a deep breath, smoothly pivoting the narrative. Edward didn't look guilty. Instead, he looked utterly exhausted. He let out a long sigh, ran a hand through his graying hair, and played the role of a burdened martyr to perfection. "I was hoping to give you one peaceful night before explaining the nightmare we've been living through," Edward said, with chilling sincerity. Richard, when you were convicted, the federal authorities didn't just want you hung behind bars. The SEC went after Caldwell Tech with everything they had. They wanted to liquidate your life's work to pay federal fines. They wanted to seize every asset and every penny you ever made. Diana stepped forward, wiping away her tearless eyes, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. We were losing everything, Richard. The board turned on us. The media painted you as a monster. We had to make a choice. We had to protect your legacy, even if it meant playing the bad guys. Edward stepped closer, his tone urgent and pleading. I hired the best defense attorneys, but they said the only way to shield the company's capital from federal seizure was to move it entirely out of your name. We had to act fast. Diana and I staged a separation of assets. We created a spousal protection trust in an offshore jurisdiction where federal agents couldn't reach it. That's the Swiss account you heard about. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder, looking at me with an expression of ultimate brotherly devotion. Today, with the final audit wrapping up, we transferred your remaining liquid assets, including the last $10 million from your retirement fund, into that trust. If we had left it in your name, the government would have seized it the moment you walked out those prison gates. We played the villains. We let everyone think we abandoned you just to save your life's work. Diana moved to my other side, resting her hand gently on my chest. When you heard me talking about sending you to a nursing home, I was just making a bitter joke about what the media expected us to do with you. We spent 12 years fighting in the shadows just to keep your empire alive. Everything we did was for you. My love, it was a masterpiece. It was the most flawless, bulletproof lie I had ever heard. If I hadn't spent 12 years of silence in a cell sharpening my mind, if I hadn't learned how to spot a liar, I would have believed them completely. The logic was tight, the legal terminology was accurate, and the emotional delivery was seamless. They had rehearsed this contingency plan to perfection. But they made one fatal mistake. They forgot that before I went to prison, I knew exactly how much money was in my retirement fund. I also knew that a spousal protection trust didn't require routing money through anonymous shell companies. They were lying straight to my face. I looked at Edward, and I looked at Diana. I realized just how incredibly dangerous they were. If I called them out right now, they would destroy the evidence. And they might even find a way to eliminate me permanently. I had no money, no power, and no allies. I needed time. I needed to play their game, and I had to play it better than them. So, I let my shoulders slump. I let out a shaky breath and forced my eyes to moisten. I let a single tear roll down my weathered cheek. I reached out and pulled them both into a tight, emotional embrace. I'm sorry, I whispered, my voice thick with fake guilt. I'm so sorry I doubted you. I've been in the dark for so long. Thank you. Thank you for making such huge sacrifices to save my life's work. I don't know what I would have done without you. Diana hugged me tightly, burying her face in my chest. Edward patted my back heavily. You're home now, Richard, Edward said softly. Everything is going to be all right. From now on, we'll take care of you. I know you will, I replied, holding them even tighter. But as I held them, staring past Edward's shoulder at the dim wall of my study, my eyes were completely dry. The forced warmth in my voice vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating emptiness. I didn't believe a single word they said. They thought they had successfully manipulated a broken, clueless old man. They thought the danger had passed. But they were wrong. The war was only just beginning. The war had only just begun. I quickly learned the rules of this new reality. Under the guise of absolute care and devotion, my brother and wife built a golden cage for me. They moved my belongings into a tiny, windowless guest room on the ground floor of the estate. The room was tucked away at the end of a long, isolated hallway, far from the main living areas. Edward told me with a patronizing smile that it was for my own safety. He said that, after sleeping on a hard prison cot for so many years, my old bones shouldn't be climbing stairs. I nodded and accepted my new quarters without complaint. I knew it had nothing to do with my comfort. It was entirely about keeping me out of the way. They wanted me out of sight and out of mind, a convenient ghost wandering the edges of their glamorous lives. The restrictions didn't stop with my room. They gave me $100 in cash every week as an allowance, claiming my bank accounts were still frozen by federal regulators. I, the man who built a $50 million tech empire, was now being handed pocket change like an incompetent teenager. Furthermore, Edward strictly forbade me from visiting the Caldwell tech headquarters under any circumstances. Claiming my sudden appearance would draw intense media scrutiny, he warned it would tank the stock price and panic investors. I agreed to stay hidden. I played the role of an exhausted, beaten-down old man who just wanted a quiet corner to live out his remaining days. But behind the closed door of my windowless room, my mind was working at full speed. I was cataloging every detail, every lie, and every piece of evidence. The physical signs of their betrayal were everywhere, displayed, right out in the open. They were arrogant, flaunting the wealth they stole from me, believing I was too naive or broken to notice the truth. One morning at the breakfast table, I watched Edward casually adjust his expensive shirt cuffs. Gleaming in the morning light was my father's vintage Patek Philippe watch. It was a rare, intricate timepiece, explicitly passed down to me on my father's deathbed. On the day of my arrest, I had left it safely inside the master bedroom safe. Edward caught me staring at his wrist. He offered a smooth smile, claiming he had managed to buy it back from a pawn shop after federal agents seized my personal property. It was a blatant lie. Federal agents never confiscated our family heirlooms. But I forced a grateful smile and thanked him sincerely for saving it. Diana was no different. As she walked through the mansion, she wore stunning jewelry I recognized instantly. One evening, she wore a dazzling diamond necklace to a charity gala, the exact custom piece I had designed for her on our 10th wedding anniversary. When I complimented it, she let out a light, dismissive laugh. She told me it was just a cheap replica she found at a local boutique, a fake piece to help her pretend she still had the life we once shared. She claimed she sold the real one to cover my mounting legal defense fees. I knew she was lying. The way the light refracted through the facets of those stones was unmistakable. They were real diamonds, my diamonds. They were wearing my life like a costume, performing a sickening play where they were the tragic heroes and I was the helpless burden they graciously tolerated. But the stolen wealth wasn't the most dangerous part of their overall scheme. The true horror of my situation revealed itself in the quiet hours of the night. Every evening, around 9 o'clock, Diana would knock gently on my bedroom door. She would walk in carrying a delicate porcelain cup of steaming chamomile tea. Her face would soften, putting on the mask of a pure, devoted angel. She told me she had read medical articles about prison-induced insomnia and the severe trauma of reintegrating into society. She insisted the tea was a special organic blend infused with natural supplements to help calm my nerves and soothe my weary mind. For the first week, I drank it. I wanted to play along, showing them I was completely reliant on their daily care, like a helpless child. But my body began to experience strange reactions. Every morning I woke up, it felt like wading through a thick, suffocating fog. My thoughts were painfully sluggish, as if I hadn't slept at all. The edges of my vision were severely blurred. Most terrifyingly, my hands began to tremble uncontrollably. I would sit on the edge of the bed, watching my fingers shake, completely unable to stop them. I was a very healthy, 70-year-old man who had maintained a strict physical regimen throughout my time in prison. Before this point, I had never experienced any neurological tremors. I remembered Diana's cold voice in the study, joking about how the media expected an inmate's brain to naturally deteriorate. I remembered Edward saying they could legally claim my sanity was lost in prison. The tremors were definitely not a natural symptom of aging. They were the direct result of deliberate, calculated poisoning. I had to test my theory without raising suspicion. The next night, when Diana brought the steaming chamomile tea, I thanked her profusely. I took a careful sip while she stood there praising the soothing qualities of the tea. Satisfied that I had swallowed her concoction, she offered a warm smile, wished me good night, and closed the door. The moment her footsteps faded down the long hallway, I moved into action. I carried the cup to a dim corner of the room. Sitting there was a heavy ceramic pot holding a large, lush green fern, something Diana had placed in the room to make it feel cozier. I poured the liquid straight into the soil of the plant. I rinsed the cup in the sink, leaving it empty on the nightstand for Diana to collect later. I repeated the process the following night, pouring the contaminated liquid directly into the roots of the fern. I waited in the silence, closely observing the plant for any changes. It didn't take long to see the results. Just 2 days later, that vibrant green fern was unrecognizable. The leaves turned a sickly, necrotic yellow. The stems shriveled and collapsed, rotting from the roots up. The plant was completely dead, killed by whatever chemical mixture Diana was brewing for me every night. I stood in my windowless room, staring at the withered leaves, my heart pounding with terrifying clarity. They weren't just stealing my money. They weren't just keeping me hidden from the world. They were actively using chemical agents to induce dementia. They were destroying my mind to ensure I could never reclaim my life or my $50 million legacy. The golden cage they built for me was actually a slow, quiet execution chamber. Discovering that Diana was actively poisoning me shifted something fundamental inside me. I was no longer a victim trying to understand why my family had stolen my wealth. I was a survivor trapped behind enemy lines. During the day, I played my role perfectly. I let my hands tremble. I dragged my feet when I walked down the hallways. I stared blankly out the windows with an empty gaze. But when the sun went down and the heavy oak doors of the estate clicked shut for the night, the fog cleared. My mind, sharpened by over 4,000 days in federal prison, became razor sharp. The golden cage they built for me was about to become my hunting ground. I waited until the grandfather clock in the main foyer struck 2. The deep, heavy chime echoed through the quiet estate, marking 2 in the morning. I knew Edward and Diana slept soundly. I slid off my narrow bed, wearing dark clothes and walking barefoot across the cold hardwood floor to avoid making the slightest sound. The mansion was pitch black, lit only by pale moonlight streaming through the tall windows. I moved through the shadows with the silent precision of a phantom. Prison had taught me how to walk without being heard, how to control my breathing, measure my steps, and blend into the dark. Blend into the dark during late-night guard patrols. My destination was the east wing of the house, where Edward's luxurious home office was located. It used to be my father's library. I reached the heavy mahogany door and grasped the brass handle. As expected, it was locked. Edward was paranoid, but his paranoia was amateur. He thought a standard tumbler lock would keep his secrets safe. He had no idea what kind of skills a man picks up when locked in a cage alongside professional thieves. I reached into my pocket and pulled out two small, rigid pieces of metal. I had crafted them earlier that day using a thick paperclip and the metal backing from a disposable razor. I slid my makeshift tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying featherlight pressure with my thumb. Then I inserted the pick, gently feeling for the locking pins inside the mechanism. One by one, I manipulated the pins. The lock yielded with a soft, satisfying click. I turned the handle, pushed the door open, slipped inside, and pulled it shut behind me. The office smelled of fine leather and expensive cigars. I walked straight to the massive oak desk in the center of the room. Edward always preferred working from home when handling sensitive matters. I pressed the power button on his sleek desktop computer. The screen lit up, casting a cool blue glow across my face. A password prompt appeared. I stood there for a moment, analyzing my brother's mindset. Edward was a man defined by boundless arrogance. I knew he wouldn't use a complex, random string of characters. He would use something familiar, something that validated his ego. I thought back to the purebred golden retriever he bought shortly after I went to prison. A dog he paraded around like a trophy. I placed my fingers on the silent keyboard and typed the dog's name, followed immediately. By the year he bought this estate, I hit enter. The system unlocked instantly. I was in. I began scanning through directories, looking for anything hidden beneath the surface. Edward was a financial officer, which meant he was meticulous with numbers. But he wasn't an IT expert. It didn't take me long to locate a hidden partition on the hard drive. Opening the folder, I found dozens of meticulously organized digital ledgers. As I opened the spreadsheets and began analyzing the data, my blood ran cold. The scale of his betrayal went far beyond anything I had imagined. Edward hadn't just stolen my money and drained my retirement account. He had completely repurposed Caldwell tech. He was using the legitimate corporate infrastructure of my life's work to run a massive international money laundering operation. The ledgers documented millions of dollars flowing in from shell companies located in South America and Eastern Europe. The money was washed through Caldwell Tech's operational expenses, disguised as consulting fees and software licensing acquisitions. Then, the clean funds were wired directly to offshore accounts, controlled by a notorious international cartel. Edward was laundering black money for the most dangerous criminals on the planet. And the most terrifying part was how he had structured the files. He was still using my name, my digital signature, and the credentials I left behind as the ultimate security shield. If federal authorities ever launched an investigation into these new transactions, the paper trail would lead straight to me. He was setting me up to take the fall for him a second time. My hands gripped the edge of the desk tightly. The sheer magnitude of his malice was suffocating. But I needed more. I needed to know exactly how it all started. I kept digging into the hidden partition, scrolling past the recent cartel transactions. At the very bottom of the directory, I noticed an encrypted folder simply labeled 2014 archives. The encryption was basic, likely left behind by old software he never bothered to update. I bypassed it using a common directory override command. The folder unzipped, spilling its contents across the screen. I stopped breathing. Displayed there in high definition were the original, unedited financial documents used to convict me a decade ago. I opened a subfolder and found the original, uncompressed image files of my forged signature. I saw the digital trail, showing exactly how Edward had manipulated the company's internal servers to make it look like I had authorized the illegal transfers. He had painstakingly fabricated the entire illusion, covering his own tracks while painting a massive target on my back. But that wasn't even the discovery that broke my heart. I opened another file titled Witness Prep Notes. It was a comprehensive, heavily edited script containing bullet points, emotional cues, and specific phrasing guidelines. As I read the words on the screen, my stomach turned violently. It was the exact testimony Diana had delivered on the witness stand during my trial. The text on the screen specified when she should cry, when she should look away from the jury, and how she should describe my supposedly erratic and greedy behavior. They had rehearsed my destruction. They sat in this very house, perhaps at this very desk, choreographing the exact performance that convinced a judge to lock me away for 20 years. Diana wasn't a coerced participant at all. She was the star witness in a carefully orchestrated execution. I was no longer fighting for my money. I was now fighting for complete and total justice for the 12 years of my life they had stolen. But I couldn't fight this battle alone. The walls of the estate were closing on me, and every electronic device inside was strictly monitored. If I accessed the internet, Edward's software would flag my activity. I was trapped on an island of their creation, and I needed a secure line of communication. To get it, I had to step outside those iron gates. The next morning, I began my performance. I shuffled into the kitchen, my hands trembling noticeably. Diana was sipping her coffee, watching me with a mix of pity and disgust. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, adopting the vacant gaze of a man losing his grip on reality. I mumbled that my room felt like a cell, and told her I just wanted to feel the sunlight and sit in the local park. Diana sighed, visibly annoyed. Having a demented old man wandering the streets would only solidify their narrative that prison had ruined my mind. She agreed, but she wasn't foolish enough to let me go unmonitored. Unmonitored. She called a man named Leon, introduced as a private medical assistant, though his heavy build suggested otherwise. He was a hired handler sent to ensure I didn't wander too far. Leon followed me down the long driveway and onto the quiet sidewalk, keeping a deliberate 30-foot distance to maintain the illusion of my independence. I walked at an excruciatingly slow, unsteady pace. Every step looked like an immense struggle. In reality, my muscles were tense, ready for action. I scanned my surroundings, looking for a specific opportunity. We arrived at the local park. It was a sprawling green space shaded by ancient oak trees, dotted with weathered wooden benches. I locked onto my target right away. A teenager was sitting on a low stone retaining wall, aggressively tapping away on a cheap smartphone, a beat-up skateboard leaning against his legs. Kids like him went through phones constantly and almost always had an old one sitting in a pocket or bag. I shuffled toward a nearby bench, making sure to deliberately catch my toe on a raised seam in the sidewalk. I let out a loud groan, slumping hard onto the wooden slats and clutching my chest. Leon paused a comfortable 30 feet away. He leaned back against a tree, pulled out his own phone, and completely checked out, thoroughly bored by his babysitting gig. He looked away for 5 whole seconds. That was all the time I needed. I leaned toward the teenager, my trembling hands suddenly turning dead steady. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a crumpled $50 bill. Half of the weekly allowance. Edward tossed my way. Looking the boy straight in the eye, I pointed at an older, cracked screen device sitting on the wall next to him and made a crisp, quiet offer. $50 for the spare phone. The kid looked surprised, but $50 for a piece of junk sitting in his backpack was a no-brainer. He snatched the cash and casually kicked the secondary phone toward my foot. In one seamless motion, I slid the device under the sole of my shoe. By the time Leon looked up from his screen, I was just massaging my knee with a pained expression. I waited 10 minutes to establish a boring, predictable rhythm. Leon eventually lost interest again, turning his back to light a cigarette. I slipped the phone out from under my shoe and hid it inside the folds of my oversized jacket. I powered it on, 14% battery remaining. Even a deactivated phone could still connect to public Wi-Fi. I quickly linked to an open network from a coffee shop across the street and opened an encrypted messaging app. I didn't need a contact list. For 12 years, I had memorized a single sequence of numbers. It belonged to Harrison Wright. Harrison was my former corporate attorney, a fiercely loyal man who had fought like hell for me during my trial. Because he refused to play ball with Edward, my brother had orchestrated a vicious smear campaign against him, fabricating ethics violations that ultimately got Harrison disbarred. Harrison had lost his entire career just for standing by me. I knew he was currently working out of a rundown office as a paralegal, barely making ends meet. I dialed his secure number. The phone rang 3 times before a weary voice picked up. "Right here," he said, sounding exhausted. I cupped my hand over my mouth, keeping my head down so Leon couldn't see my lips moving. "Harrison," I said quietly, my voice utterly steady. "It's Richard." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. A long, heavy silence stretched over the line as Harrison processed the shock of hearing my voice. When he finally spoke, the exhaustion was entirely gone, replaced by raw emotion. "Richard," Harrison gasped, "they said you got out. I've been waiting for your call. I knew you wouldn't just disappear." "They think I'm a completely broken, demented old man," I whispered. "They think they've got me locked in a cage. But I found the hidden ledgers, Harrison. I found the archives. I know exactly what Edward did, and I know who helped him. The hunt is on." I heard the scrape of a chair on the floor from his end. "Tell me what you need, boss. I've waited 12 years to bring that arrogant monster down. Just say the word, and I'll help you burn his fraudulent empire to the ground. I need you to prepare the contingency plans we discussed during your last prison visit," I instructed. "But first, I need to know his timeline. What is his immediate move?" Harrison's voice dropped an octave, turning dead serious. "You have to move fast, Richard. I still have reliable contacts in the financial district who feed me intel on Caldwell Tech. Edward isn't just laundering money for the cartel anymore. He's trying to cash out and walk away completely." "What do you mean?" I asked, my eyes darting over to check on Leon, who was still checking his watch. "He's finalizing a massive corporate acquisition," Harrison warned. "Edward has arranged a deal to sell Caldwell Tech to a European conglomerate. The buyers are heavily insulated, likely another front for his illicit partners. The acquisition is structured as a $300 million cash buyout in clean, untraceable capital. Once he signs that company away, he and Diana are going to disappear to a country without an extradition treaty. You'll be left holding an empty shell. When is the deal scheduled to close? I pressed, feeling a surge of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. Before the end of the month, Harrison answered grimly. You have less than 3 weeks before he legally transfers ownership and vanishes with everything you built. If he puts his signature on that transfer deed, the European buyers will liquidate the assets, tear down the infrastructure, and bury the evidence forever. I stared silently at the dead grass beneath my shoes, calculating the precise angles of my next move. The clock was officially ticking. 3 weeks. I had exactly 3 weeks to dismantle a criminal enterprise, expose my treacherous brother, and secure my justice before they vanished forever. I'll be ready, I assured him softly before severing the secure connection and carefully tucking the cheap phone back into the lining of my shoe. The slow walk back to the sprawling estate felt entirely different from the trip out. Every step I took burned with a cold, razor-sharp purpose. I finally had a deadline. 3 short weeks. I had 3 weeks to systematically break down the fortress my brother had built on top of my stolen legacy. The moment I stepped back inside the mansion, I flipped the switch and resumed my performance. I shuffled through the grand foyer, letting my shoulders drop and keeping my gaze glued to the polished floors. I made sure my left hand trembled just enough to be picked up by the security cameras. The golden cage was closing in on me, but they had no idea I had already stolen the key to lock them inside it instead. That evening, the vast dining room felt suffocating. The massive mahogany table stretched between us like a battlefield. I sat at the far end, staring down at a bowl of bland, lukewarm soup. Edward sat at the head, carving into a thick steak with the aggressive precision of a man who believed he owned the world. Diana sat across from him, elegantly sipping a glass of deep red wine. They chatted about trivial social events, completely ignoring my presence. But I knew Edward too well. I knew the specific cadence of his voice when he was setting a trap. He wiped his mouth, took a slow sip of wine, and turned his eyes toward me. His gaze was sharp, calculating, and completely void of genuine humanity. Richard, Edward began, his tone dripping with fake concern. I know the transition back to civilian life has been overwhelming for you. We just want you to focus entirely on resting. However, there is a minor legal formality we need to take care of tonight to ensure you are fully protected. He reached into the breast pocket of his custom suit and pulled out a neatly folded document. He slid it across the polished wood until it came to rest right beside my soup bowl. Bold black letters at the top of the page read, "Complete waiver and release of rights." I want you to know this is purely a formality, Edward continued smoothly, because federal regulators are still aggressively sniffing around our offshore accounts. Our legal team strongly advises that you legally sever yourself from the corporate entity once and for all. By signing this, you legally renounce any future claims to Caldwell, Tech, and its subsidiary holdings. You'll be classified as completely destitute on paper, meaning the government can never harass you for financial restitution. You'll be safe, and Diana and I will continue to take care of you for the rest of your life. I stared down at the crisp white paper. This was the exact key piece of documentation. Edward needed to execute his $300 million buyout with his cartel associates. Without my explicit signature waiving all rights, no buyer would risk taking on a massive legal dispute from the original founder. He needed me to willingly hand over the keys to the kingdom. I let my hands start to shake violently. Opening my eyes wide, I put on an expression of extreme confusion and vulnerability. I reached out to touch the edge of the paper, my fingers trembling heavily against the table. "Edward," I mumbled, my voice weak and raspy, deliberately slurring my words slightly. "I don't understand. Caldwell Tech was my whole life. I built it from nothing. Why do I have to sign my name away? Can't we just wait? I've been feeling so confused lately. My head feels heavy all the time." The warm, brotherly smile on Edward's face vanished in an instant, replaced by a flash of genuine irritation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Diana cut in front of him. The sweet, angelic facade she had maintained for weeks shattered completely. She slammed her crystal glass onto the table with a sharp, aggressive thud. Leaning forward, resting her elbows on the mahogany wood, she locked her eyes onto mine with a cold, venomous intensity. "Richard." "Sweetheart," Diana said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, hissing whisper. "You need to listen to us very carefully. The doctors have been crystal clear about your prognosis. They say your brain is deteriorating rapidly. The severe trauma of federal prison accelerated your cognitive decline. We see it every single day. You drag your feet when you walk. You can't keep track of simple conversations. And your hands won't stop shaking." She tilted her head, her gaze sharp enough to cut glass. "If you don't sign that document tonight, to protect this family, Edward and I might be forced to petition for full medical conservatorship. If the state determines you are mentally unfit to make your own decisions, you won't be able to stay in this beautiful house anymore. You wouldn't want to spend your final years locked in a cold, sterile psychiatric facility, strapped to a bed and forgotten by the world. Would you?" The sheer cruelty of her threat hung heavy in the air. She was holding a loaded gun directly at my freedom. If I fought back right now, they were fully prepared to have me declared insane and locked away in an asylum. I knew what I had to do. I let out a loud, pathetic gasp. Deliberately letting go, my heavy silver spoon dropped from my grip. It clattered loudly against the porcelain bowl before rolling onto the floor. I pulled my hands back, pressing them tightly against my chest. I made my entire body shiver, playing the role of a broken, terrified old man to absolute perfection. "Please," I whimpered, staring at the document with wide, fearful eyes. "Please, Diana, don't send me to a hospital. I can't go back into a cage. I can't be locked away again. I'll sign it." Edward let out a long sigh of relief, his arrogant smile instantly returning. He pulled a gold pen from his pocket and held it out across the table. "That's a very wise decision, Richard," he said soothingly. "Just put your name on the dotted line and your troubles will be gone forever." I reached out to take the pen, but then jerked my hand back, shaking my head frantically. I forced a stubborn, childish look onto my face, clinging to a fake sense of pride. "No," I stammered, making my voice sound unhinged and desperate. "Not like this. Not in the dark. Caldwell Tech was my legacy. If I have to give it up, I won't do it hiding in the dark like a criminal. I want to say a proper goodbye." Edward frowned in annoyance. "What on earth are you talking about?" "Richard, just sign the paper. Next week is the company's 30th anniversary." I blurted out, my voice trembling. "I know you're throwing a massive gala. If I'm giving away my life's work, I want to do it there. I want to stand on that stage one last time. I'll sign your document in front of everyone and say goodbye to my legacy properly. If you don't let me have this one last thing, I won't sign. At all." A calculating silence fell over the dining room. Edward and Diana exchanged a long, silent look. Having the founder publicly sign away his rights at a high-profile corporate gala would be the ultimate public relations victory. It would completely legitimize his ownership to the European buyers. It was a bizarre demand from a broken man, but it served his sinister plan perfectly. Edward slowly set the heavy gold pen back down on the table. He looked at me with immense pity and absolute triumph. "If it gives you peace of mind, Richard," he said softly, "then we'll do it your way. You'll sign the waiver on stage at the gala next week." I dropped my head, burying my face in my trembling hands, making it look like I was weeping over the devastating loss of my empire. But behind the safety of my fingers, the corners of my mouth curled into a cold, lethal smile. The trap was officially set. They had no idea what was waiting for them. The next morning, Edward announced that a mandatory medical assessment was required before the corporate transfer could be finalized. A private phlebotomist arrived at the estate. It was Harrison, dressed in crisp blue scrubs and wearing a white surgical mask. Playing his professional role flawlessly, he instructed me to step into the guest room bathroom for the draw. Diana hovered in the hallway like a hawk, but she didn't step inside. The moment the door closed, Harrison turned on the sink faucet to drown out our voices. He drew a small vial of blood to keep the visit looking completely legitimate. While applying a bandage to my arm, he reached into his medical kit and pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen, along with a flesh-colored micro earpiece. He pressed them firmly into my palm. "This pen contains a specially formulated ink reservoir," Harrison whispered. "The ink completely vanishes 24 hours after hitting the paper. The earpiece is synced to a secure frequency. Wear it at the gala. And Richard," I finally made contact with my key insider at the FBI. "The net is ready. If Edward catches on to anything before you use that pen, you'll be legally locked in an asylum before dawn." I nodded, slipping the pen and earpiece deep into my pocket. Harrison packed up his kit, turned off the tap, and escorted me out. Diana inspected my bandaged arm and gave a satisfied nod. Harrison left the estate, leaving me once again in the lion's den. The days leading up to the anniversary gala were pure psychological torture. As the acquisition date drew closer, Edward and Diana grew increasingly paranoid. They wanted to make sure my mind was completely shattered before pushing me into the spotlight and under the cameras. Diana doubled down on her efforts. She began bringing the steaming, toxic chamomile tea to my room twice a day. She would stand right beside my bed, her eyes cold and demanding, refusing to leave until I swallowed every last drop. I had to adapt immediately. I couldn't just pour the tea into the potted plant while she watched. I mastered a dangerous technique, palming the neurotoxic pills she crushed into the liquid. I would take a small sip, hold the bitter liquid in the back of my throat, pretend to swallow, and let the dissolved sediment slide into a tiny wadded paper towel hidden in my cupped hand. It was a terrifying high-stakes performance. If I accidentally swallowed even a fraction of the heavy doses she was administering, my mind really would shatter. I spent hours alone in my room, violently scrubbing my tongue and rinsing my mouth to flush out any traces of the toxin. I maintained my cover, keeping my hands shaking and my eyes unfocused, giving them the empty, broken man they so desperately wanted to see. That week, Edward's arrogance swelled to unbearable heights. He began taking prospective European investors on tours around the estate. I knew exactly who these men were. They were high-level representatives from the cartel, dressed in tailored Italian suits, posing as legitimate businessmen. Edward would lead them into the grand living room, offering them my expensive cigars and pouring them my aged scotch. He would point to me sitting quietly in the corner, introducing me as his tragic, demented older brother who had lost his grip on reality after getting out of prison. The men would look at me with mocking pity, laughing loudly at Edward's cruel jokes. I sat there in total silence, clenching my jaw, swallowing every single insult, and engraving every single face in that room into my memory. The breaking point arrived 2 nights before the gala. The cartel representatives had just left the estate, and Edward was riding a wave of pure adrenaline. He poured himself another glass of bourbon and walked into the living room where I was sitting by the fireplace. Standing in front of the roaring fire, he admired his reflection in the massive ornate mirror above the mantel. He slowly unclasped my father's vintage pocket watch from his wrist. Holding the gold watch up to the light, he turned it in his hand with an expression of supreme satisfaction. He deliberately placed the watch right in the center of the mantel, right next to a framed photograph of our family from 20 years ago. Looking down at me, his eyes filled with decades of suppressed jealousy and bitter resentment. "You know, Richard," he said in a patronizing tone, "the old man always favored the weaker son. He gave you the company. He gave you the watch. He treated you like the golden boy while I did all the dirty work in the shadows. But look at us now. Look where his precious golden boy ended up. You're a broken inmate waiting to be checked into a mental ward, and I'm about to become one of the wealthiest men in this country. The world always corrects its mistakes." The sheer audacity of his words sent a blinding flash of rage through my entire body. I wanted to leap out of my chair. I wanted to wrap my hands around his throat and choke the life out of him. I had to bite down on my tongue so hard that the thick metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. Forcing myself to look down at the floor, I let my shoulders shake, playing the role of a defeated coward. I swallowed my blood and my pride, reminding myself that true justice required absolute, unshakable patience. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. The atmosphere in the mansion was charged with tense energy. Diana burst into my room carrying a garment bag. She tossed it roughly onto my bed. From the deepest corner of my closet, she had deliberately picked an ill-fitting, outdated tuxedo. The jacket was 2 sizes too big, and the trousers hung loosely around my ankles. She wanted me to look as pathetic and diminished as possible when I walked onto that stage. She wanted the world to see a man who had completely given up on life. I dressed slowly, letting my hands fumble clumsily with the buttons. Diana stepped close into my personal space to adjust my collar. She roughly pinned a white boutonniere onto my lapel, the sharp pin pricking my chest. Grabbing my jaw tightly, she forced my face up to look straight into her cold, merciless eyes. "Smile for the cameras tonight, old man," she hissed, her breath hot against my face. "Do exactly what we rehearsed. You walk up those steps, you put your name on that paper, and you keep smiling. Because after tonight, you cease to exist." I looked back at her, letting my jaw tremble in fake terror. But deep inside the pocket of my oversized trousers, my fingers wrapped tightly around the cold, heavy silver pen Harrison had given me. I was fully prepared now. 12 long years of absolute isolation had forged my soul into indestructible steel. Taking a quiet, deep breath, I steadied my pounding heart. They thought they were walking me to the slaughterhouse, but I was leading them straight to the gallows. After tonight, you cease to exist. Diana's venomous words echoed repeatedly in my head during the limousine ride to the Plaza Hotel. The interior of the car was dead silent. Diana sat rigid across from me, her posture stiff, as she coldly judged my deliberately disheveled appearance. I stared out the tinted window at the passing city lights, letting my jaw hang slightly slack to complete the tragic illusion. When the limousine door opened, a storm of camera flashes erupted into the crisp New York night air. I gripped the wooden handle of my heavy walking cane tightly, forcing my knuckles to tremble as I hauled myself up from the back seat. Reporters shouted my name, their voices deafening, fueled by a mix of morbid curiosity and predatory excitement. I hunched my shoulders forward, flinching under the blinding flashes, like a terrified, broken animal. Shuffling across the long red carpet, I let the rubber tip of my cane drag against the fabric to emphasize my fabricated frailty. Diana stepped out right behind me, instantly transforming into the tragic, fiercely protective wife. She placed a gentle hand on my lower back, fending off aggressive reporters while offering the cameras a perfectly practiced smile of deep exhaustion and grief. Every single step toward the grand brass doors was a carefully calculated performance. I made my breathing heavy and shallow, portraying a ruined man left behind by the world. We stepped into the opulent foyer, the heavy doors shutting out the noisy press. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over hundreds of guests dressed in tailored black tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns. These were the industry elite, corporate titans and powerful investors who had once begged to do business with me. 12 years ago, when federal agents raided my office, every single person in this room had abandoned me. They erased my number, canceled our lucrative contracts, and publicly condemned me just to save their own fragile reputations. Now, as I shuffled through the crowded room, the sea of elegant guests parted automatically before me. Conversations abruptly died down. I felt their heavy stares pressing onto my hunched shoulders. I clearly saw the flashes of pity in their eyes, immediately followed by silent disgust. They were looking at a ghost, a tragic cautionary tale of corporate greed, a miserable soul who had rotted in a concrete cell for over a decade. I kept my eyes locked onto the intricate geometric patterns of the polished marble floor, refusing to make eye contact with the cowards who had left me for dead. As we navigated through the quieted crowd, I let my hands shake visibly, feeding into their arrogant assumptions. They truly believed I was a pathetic, senile old man who deserved this miserable end. They had no idea that the fragile inmate shuffling past them was quietly cataloging every face in the room, preparing to burn their corrupt ecosystem to the ground. At the far end of the grand ballroom, near a wide stage, my brother was holding court like a king. Edward wore a tailored suit, our father's vintage pocket watch gleaming on his wrist. He was shaking hands with 4 sharply dressed men introduced as distinguished European investors. The wealthy saviors supposed to inject $300 million of clean capital into Caldwell Tech. I knew exactly who they were. I recognized their dead eyes and their disciplined, aggressive posture. They weren't venture capitalists. They were senior financial brokers for an international cartel, wrapped in expensive silk and imported leather to close the ultimate money laundering deal. Edward clapped one of the men on the back and laughed loudly at a shared joke, projecting the image of a corporate visionary in complete control. The overhead lights dimmed, and the room fell silent. Edward smoothly excused himself from the cartel representatives and walked up the steps to the main stage. Stepping behind a clear crystal podium, he adjusted the microphone with effortless arrogance. Behind him, a massive digital screen displayed the 30-year anniversary logo of the company I had built with my own 2 hands. Edward cleared his throat, his voice echoing smoothly through the vast space. He delivered a sickeningly sweet, wildly hypocritical speech. He talked about the immense challenges of the past decade, the heavy burden of executive leadership, and the painful necessity of guiding a family legacy through deep darkness. He feigned tragic grief when mentioning my long prison sentence, calling it a deeply sad chapter that had finally reached a peaceful conclusion. He painted himself as the tireless, devoted guardian of the Caldwell family name, a loyal, younger brother who had sacrificed everything to protect my original vision from complete destruction. The audience listened intently, completely mesmerized by his masterclass performance. At the end of his monologue, he announced the bright dawn of a new era, anchored by a massive corporate acquisition that would secure the company's future for generations. But before we finalize this historic transition, Edward said, his voice dropping to a respectful, emotional whisper, I want to formally pay tribute to the man who started it all. He suffered greatly, and his mind is no longer what it once was. But he is here tonight to give us his final blessing. Please join me in welcoming my older brother, Richard Caldwell. A polite, restrained ripple of applause filled the ballroom. Edward extended a hand, motioning for me to join him on the brightly lit stage. Beside me, Diana's gentle guiding hand suddenly turned into an iron vice. Her sharp, manicured fingers pinched painfully into my bicep through the thin fabric of my oversized tuxedo jacket. Gripping my arm with terrifying force, she physically pulled me forward through the parting crowd. I leaned heavily on my wooden cane, dragging my feet against the carpet to make every agonizing step look like an exhausting ordeal. Diana guided me toward the short flight of steps leading to the stage. I deliberately stumbled on the first step, letting out a small, pathetic gasp loud enough for nearby guests to hear. She yanked me up onto the platform. Facing the flashing cameras, her painted-on smile never wavered, even though her cruel grip felt like a shackle dragging a condemned man to the gallows. Reaching the top of the steps, I shuffled slowly toward the podium. Placed directly under the harsh overhead spotlights was a thick stack of legal documents, the final $300 million waiver contract. It was the exact piece of paper designed to erase every trace of my existence and hand my empire over to ruthless criminals. I stared down at the crisp white pages, my body shivering uncontrollably for the benefit of the attentive crowd. But my mind was locked entirely onto the cold, heavy silver pen tucked inside my dark jacket pocket. The heavy silence in the ballroom pressed against my chest like a physical weight. I stood before the clear crystal podium, looking out over a sea of expectant faces. The flashing camera lights paused, as if the entire room was holding its breath. To my left stood a state-appointed notary, a stern-faced woman holding an official leather binder. She was there to legally verify that I was of sound mind, or at least sound enough to sign away the rest of my life. To my right stood Edward, trembling with barely suppressed ecstasy. His eyes were wide, gleaming with greed and undeniable triumph. He had waited 12 long years for this exact moment. He had ruined my reputation, stolen my wealth, and poisoned my tea, all to cross this specific finish line. Edward took a deliberate step toward me, Reaching into his tailored tuxedo, he pulled out a heavy gold pen. The same pen our father had used decades ago to sign the company's founding documents. Edward held the pen out to me, adjusting his position so the camera lenses could capture this poetic transfer of power. He wanted the world to watch the broken founder hand over his legacy using a family heirloom. He placed the gold tip right beside the thick stack of legal papers resting on the podium. "Richard," Edward said, his voice dripping with false, comforting warmth for the crowd. "It's time. Just sign your name on the marked lines, and you can finally rest." I stared at the gold pen. I made my breathing quick and shallow. Raising my right hand, I made my fingers tremble so violently that it looked impossible for me to grip anything. I reached toward his offered hand, but then I stopped. I pulled my hand back, shaking my head with a slow, exaggerated stubbornness. Reaching into the dark pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket, my fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy silver metal of the custom pen Harrison had smuggled to me. I pulled it out slowly, holding it tightly with both trembling hands to keep it from slipping. "I prefer to use my own," I mumbled shakily, making sure my voice cracked just enough to sound thoroughly pathetic. Edward frowned, a flash of genuine impatience crossing his polished face. He glanced at the silver pen in my hand. He didn't recognize it, but he didn't care to argue either. He just wanted the signature. Forcing a tight, condescending smile, he took a step back and gestured grandly toward the documents. "Have it your way, Richard," he replied smoothly. "Just sign the papers." I turned my focus to the thick stack of contracts. The bright overhead spotlights reflected off the crisp white paper, highlighting the dotted lines waiting for my name. I knew exactly what this ink was designed to do. Harrison had formulated it seamlessly. The chemical structure would adhere to the paper for 24 hours, looking completely legitimate to the notary and the buyers. But once exposed to ambient air for a full day, the molecular bond would break down entirely. The ink would evaporate without a trace. By tomorrow evening, this $300 million waiver would be nothing more than a stack of blank, worthless paper. I leaned forward over the podium, resting, my weight heavily on my left arm and propping the wooden cane awkwardly against my hip. Positioning the silver pen over the first dotted line, I made sure my hand shook violently for the cameras. The press needed to see a man struggling with his motor functions. I let the silver tip hover and wobble just above the paper. The moment the metal point touched the surface, the shaking stopped completely. My mind locked into absolute, impenetrable focus. I signed my name flawlessly. A strong, decisive signature belonging to the man who built Caldwell Tech from a humble garage into a global empire. I flipped to the second page, then the third. I signed away my patents. I signed away my voting rights. I signed away my corporate shares. With every completed page, I allowed the heavy trembling to return to my hand, keeping the illusion seamless. The entire process took 3 agonizing minutes. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the metal tip scraping against the heavy paper. When I finally flipped to the last page and executed the final stroke of my name, I let out a loud, shuddering sigh. I dropped the silver pen onto the podium, letting it clatter loudly against the glass. Slumping backward, I gripped the wooden cane with both hands, looking like a man who had just run an exhausting marathon and collapsed at the finish line. Edward didn't waste a single second. The moment the pen left my hand, he lunged forward. With the aggressive speed of a hungry predator, he snatched the thick stack of papers off the podium. He didn't even wait for the notary to inspect the pages first. holding the signed contract high in the air like a championship trophy. He turned to face the crowd with an expression of pure, unadulterated victory. The grand ballroom erupted instantly into polite, restrained applause. The cartel representatives sitting in the front row nodded silently in satisfaction, knowing their massive laundering operation was now legally insulated. Photographers snapped hundreds of pictures, capturing the triumphant new owner, with the frail, ruined founder slumped in the background. Diana stepped onto the stage, joining Edward under the bright lights. She wrapped her arm around his waist, beaming radiantly for the media. They had won. They had systematically cleared every obstacle, poisoned my mind, stolen my wealth, and legally secured their $300 million exit strategy. Diana rested her head on his shoulder, closing her eyes in sweet relief. The nightmare of my return was finally over for them. They had executed the ultimate corporate heist right in front of the world, and nobody suspected a thing. They were completely untouchable now. Edward lowered the documents and turned his back on the cheering crowd. Taking a step toward me, he maintained a warm, brotherly smile for the cameras. But as he leaned in to embrace me, his mouth pressed directly against my ear. His voice dropped to a vicious, mocking whisper meant for me alone. "Thanks for the company, loser," Edward hissed, his breath thick with expensive bourbon. "The guys in the white coats are waiting for you at the back exit. Enjoy the rest of your life in the ward." He stepped back, giving my shoulder a firm, patronizing pat. Turning back toward the microphone, he raised both hands to quiet the applauding crowd, preparing to deliver his grand closing statement. Formally dismiss me from the stage and erase me from his life forever. Except I didn't walk away. I stood straight up. The fabricated weakness that had consumed my muscles for the past 3 weeks vanished instantly. I squared my back, pulled my shoulders straight, and lifted my chin high. The slouched, shuffling posture of a heavily medicated inmate evaporated, replaced by the tall, unyielding presence of a man who had built a $50 million empire from scratch. I loosened my grip on the heavy wooden cane. I didn't need it anymore. Letting it slip from my fingers, I tossed the cane right off the stage. The solid wood crashed hard against the marble floor below, making a loud, violent thud that echoed through the room. The sound of solid wood striking polished marble cut through the polite applause like a gunshot. Every single eye in the vast room snapped toward the stage. They expected to see a frail, broken man collapsing under the weight of his tragic fate. They expected the founder of Caldwell Tech to crumble into a pathetic heap of grief and regret. What they saw was something else entirely. I took a step forward. I didn't shuffle. My stride was large, powerful, and brimming with intimidating, restrained energy. Edward was standing right beside the crystal podium, and his arrogant smile froze completely as he tried to process this sudden, impossible transformation. He opened his mouth to whisper something to me, likely another vicious insult to keep me in line. But before he could utter a single syllable, I raised my arm. I didn't strike him. I simply placed my palm firmly against his chest and pushed him aside. The sheer physical strength behind my movement shocked him. He stumbled backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished stage floor as he nearly lost his balance. Taking his spot, I grabbed the edges of the crystal podium with rock-solid, perfectly steady hands. The bright spotlights washed over my face as I leaned into the microphone. "Thank you, Edward," I began. My voice didn't shake. It didn't break or quiver with the confusion of dementia. It boomed through the massive speakers, deep, sharp, and commanding, vibrating with the absolute authority I had buried for 12 long years. The sound of my true voice hit the audience like a physical blow. The polite applause died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, bewildered silence. I looked straight at the front row, locking eyes with the four men in tailored Italian suits posing as European venture capitalists. But before the buyers wire $300 million into your offshore accounts, I think they should know exactly what they're buying today. A collective gasp rippled through the crowded ballroom. The titans of industry and business elites, who had been politely applauding my downfall just moments ago, were now exchanging tense, confused looks. The cartel representatives in the front row shed their relaxed posture, instantly turning rigid and aggressive. They realized their perfect laundering deal was going sideways. Regaining his balance, Edward lunged back toward the podium, his face turning bright red with sudden, manic panic. "Richard, stop this right now," Edward hissed, keeping his voice as low as possible to avoid the microphone, though the sheer terror in his eyes gave him away. He reached out to grab my arm, desperately trying to pull me away from center stage. I simply shifted my weight, blocking him with my shoulder, and standing like an immovable wall of solid granite. Edward realized he couldn't physically remove me without causing a massive, humiliating scene in front of the flashing cameras. He reached frantically for the small control panel set into the edge of the podium, slamming his thumb onto the main mute button to cut the audio output. He pressed it once. He pressed it twice. He pounded his fist against the plastic console. Nothing happened. The microphone remained fully live, picking up his heavy, panicked breathing and broadcasting it to the entire room. What he didn't know was that the audio-visual control room overlooking the ballroom was no longer operated by hotel staff. My fiercely loyal former attorney, Harrison Wright, had slipped in through the catering entrance 10 minutes earlier. He's sitting in this dark booth wearing a stolen uniform, having physically locked out the main audio console. Harrison had overridden the podium controls, ensuring nobody on that stage could turn off my microphone. Edward stared at the glowing green light on the mic. As he realized his technical safety net had completely failed, his composure started to break. Seeing the technical failure, Diana decided to step in. Breaking out of her rigid posture near the steps, she charged forward, her high heels clicking loudly against the floor. She lunged toward me, abandoning her graceful demeanor out of pure, desperate survival instinct. She waved her arms frantically at the venue security stationed around the room. "Security, get up here right now!" Diana screamed, her sharp voice echoing in the quiet ballroom. "Please, you have to help my husband. Grab him and take him out the back door immediately." Turning to the crowd, she forced an expression of deep agony and tearful grief onto her panicked face. "Everyone, I am so sorry. Please forgive this disruption. Richard is suffering from a severe episode of dementia. The trauma of prison completely destroyed his mind. He doesn't know where he is or what he's saying. The doctors warned us this kind of breakdown would happen. We need medical professionals right now." Two burly security guards in dark suits moved hesitantly toward the stage steps, unsure of how to proceed. They had been briefed to handle a demented, unpredictable inmate, but the man standing behind the podium looked neither insane nor confused. Looking straight at the approaching guards, I calmly raised a single hand in a commanding gesture that demanded absolute obedience. The guards froze instantly, their instincts telling them not to cross that line. I turned my focus back to the woman who had orchestrated my destruction. Diana stood just 2 feet away, her chest heaving, her eyes silently begging me to collapse and surrender. I looked into the beautiful yet treacherous face of the woman I had once loved more than life itself. I recalled 12 years of isolation. I remembered the forged documents, and I pictured the withered, dead fern in the corner of my windowless room. I leaned into the mic. "I am not demented, Diana," I roared. The sheer volume and raw fury of my voice rattled the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead, booming through the ballroom and stripping away every lie she had ever told. "And I certainly haven't been drinking your poisoned chamomile tea laced with heavy neurotoxins over the past month." Diana recoiled in terror, as if I had struck her across the face. Every bit of color drained from her skin, leaving her looking like a terrified, hollow ghost. The audience erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and frantic whispers. The reporters' camera flashes went wild, capturing the exact moment the perfect illusion shattered, into a million pieces. Edward backed away, his hands shaking, his sharp business mind completely unable to comprehend how the dead man he buried had dug his way out of the grave. Reaching into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket, I pulled out the small silver flash drive Harrison had given me in the bathroom. I held it high in the air, letting the bright stage lights reflect off the metal surface so everyone in the room could see it clearly. "Our fairy tale is over," I announced, my voice cutting through the rising chaos like a scythe. "Tonight, you wanted to celebrate Caldwell Tech. You wanted to sell my legacy to the highest bidder. Let's show these investors what they're actually buying. Let's look at the real portfolio of Caldwell Tech." I didn't need to hand it to an AV technician. Harrison had already wired his laptop directly into the hotel's main projection system from the locked booth upstairs. I simply gave a short, firm nod toward the dark glass window at the back of the hall. Instantly, the glowing 30-year anniversary logo on the massive screen behind me vanished. The screen went black for less than a second before relighting in blinding, high-definition clarity. It didn't display company milestones or quarterly profit forecasts. It showcased page after page of heavily annotated international bank statements, complex offshore routing numbers and classified cartel communications. The documents were blown up 20 feet high, making it impossible for anyone in the room to ignore the grim reality of what was happening. Pointing at the screen, I let my finger trace the intricate network of illegal wire transfers Edward had authorized using my forged signature. Bold red arrows clearly linked shell companies in South America directly to Caldwell Tech's operational accounts. The raw, unfiltered truth was finally laid bare for all to see. The initial silence in the grand ballroom shattered completely, replaced by a chaotic wave of overlapping noise. The wealthy, corporate elites who had been politely applauding my downfall just minutes ago were now shouting in extreme confusion and rising fear. Men in tailored tuxedos pointed at the screen, recognizing the massive scale of financial crimes displayed right before them. Women in evening gowns covered their mouths, backing away as they realized the dangerous reality of the situation. The most dramatic reaction came directly from the front row. The 4 cartel representatives, the dangerous men, Edward, had proudly presented as European venture capitalists, abandoned their cool, polished demeanor entirely. Double body. The moment the offshore routing numbers flashed across the giant screen, their faces twisted with genuine panic. They knew instantly that their highly insulated laundering network was completely compromised. They didn't stick around for a detailed explanation. Pushing back their heavy wooden chairs, they knocked over crystal, champagne flutes, and floral arrangements, shoving through the bewildered crowd of guests. Keeping their heads down, they moved toward the heavy brass exit doors at the back of the ballroom with a trained, aggressive urgency. They abandoned Edward entirely, leaving him to sink along with the massive ship he had so arrogantly steered into a storm of destruction. I didn't let the momentum slow for a single second. Gripping the edges of the crystal podium, I stayed close to the live microphone. "You wanted a speech about the future of this family's legacy," I declared, my voice cutting through the mounting panic. "Let's listen to what my brother and my wife had envisioned for my future." I gave Harrison another subtle nod. The massive screen split down the middle, keeping the financial documents on the left, while a pulsing audio waveform appeared on the right. A loud burst of static hissed through the hotel's state-of-the-art surround sound system, followed by crystal-clear audio. It was the original recording, captured by my hidden device during my very first night back at the estate. Edward's arrogant, boastful voice filled the grand ballroom, echoing off the high gilded ceilings. "I completed the transaction an hour ago," his recorded voice proclaimed proudly. "Every trace of his liquid assets has been erased, laundered through 3 shell companies, and deposited into our Swiss account. The 70-year-old inmate has nothing to his name now." The crowd let out a collective gasp of horror. Then Diana's cold, mocking laugh played through the speakers. Stripped of her angelic facade, the sound was chilling. "Good," her recorded voice answered with chilling cruelty. "Let him come home. What can he possibly do? He's a broken, penniless old man. If he shows up here demanding his life back, we'll just commit him to a cheap state nursing home. We can claim his mind deteriorated in prison. Nobody will question us. We hold the power of attorney." The pure malice in their own words hung heavy in the air. A rock-solid confession broadcast to the most powerful people in the city. The effect of the recording was devastating. Diana, who had been standing rigidly near the edge of the stage, seemed to physically shrink as her own cruel words washed over the audience. She realized that every prominent socialite, wealthy investor, and powerful journalist in the room was staring at her with unvarnished, absolute disgust. The narrative of the devoted, tragic wife she had carefully cultivated for 12 years had completely disintegrated. She let out a faint, pained wail that lacked any of her usual dramatic flair. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the hard, polished stage surface, her expensive silk gown pooling around her trembling legs. She raised her shaking hands to cover her face, as if trying to physically block out the overwhelming shame and the judgment of the crowd. Curled into a ball, a broken, pathetic shadow crying openly on the floor, she finally felt a fraction of the deep, suffocating humiliation she had so willingly inflicted on me for over a decade. Edward, however, refused to surrender gracefully. Drenched in sweat, heavy beads rolled down his flushed, terrified face. His bloodshot eyes darted around the chaotic ballroom, watching his wealthy buyers flee, and his meticulously built reputation burn to the ground. Spotting a backup microphone sitting on a small table near the stage steps, he lunged for it, gripping the heavy metal stand with pale, desperate knuckles. Turning it on, his breathing was unnaturally heavy. "This is fake," Edward screamed into the backup mic, his voice cracking from raw, unadulterated desperation. "Don't listen to him. This audio is a deep fake." He's a convicted felon trying to sabotage a legitimate business transaction. Pointing a trembling finger at me, his chest heaved with every heavy breath. He's insane. He's crazy. And it doesn't matter what he shows you. Reaching inside his tailored jacket, he pulled out the thick stack of papers I had signed just minutes ago. He waved the waiver contract wildly in the air, above his head, like a desperate shield trying to ward off the tide of impending destruction. He just signed away all his rights right on that podium. I have his signature right here. I have his signature right here. The company is legally mine, and I am finalizing the deal right now. You can never stop me from taking what is rightfully mine, Richard. Edward stood there panting, holding the signed waiver aloft. His chest heaved beneath his tailored tuxedo. He had been backed into a corner of his own making. But his massive ego wouldn't allow him to surrender. He gripped the backup microphone, his knuckles white, scanning the grand ballroom for any sign of support. But there was none. The corporate elites who had idolized him just 10 minutes ago were now staring back with horror and disgust. Even in his panic, Edward tried to maintain his grip on power. Pointing a shaking finger at me, sweat poured down his face. "He's a convicted felon," Edward screamed, his voice cracking horribly through the speakers. "He forged those documents. He's just extorting me because he's broke and bitter. It doesn't matter. The company is legally mine. I have the signed papers right here. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even flinch. I just stood behind the crystal podium, looking at my brother with a warm, terrifyingly calm smile. The sheer serenity of my expression made his frantic screaming look all the more pathetic. Reaching out, I tapped the microphone in front of me to ensure the higher room would hear my next words clearly. "Edward," I began, my tone remarkably gentle, almost conversational. "You were always so obsessed with paperwork, but you really should have paid a little more attention to who was sitting at your table. About that contract you're holding, you might want to double-check the identity of your buyers." Edward froze. His frantic gaze shifted from my face down to the front row, searching for the four suave European venture capitalists who were supposed to save him. Before Edward could process what I meant, a deafening crash echoed from the back of the ballroom. The heavy, gilded brass doors were kicked open with immense force, slamming against the marble walls. The polite, elegant atmosphere of the corporate gala shattered instantly. Dozens of heavily armed tactical agents flooded into the room. They wore dark tactical gear with bright yellow letters emblazoned across their vests, FBI and SEC. The sheer mass of their synchronized movement shook the floor. "Federal agents, nobody move!" a booming voice commanded over a heavy megaphone. "Stay where you are and keep your hands visible." Wealthy guests screamed and scattered, pressing their backs against the floral-decorated walls, terrified by the sudden tactical intrusion. But the real shock came from the very front row. The four men in expensive Italian suits, the men Edward had proudly introduced as distinguished European investors, didn't run for the exits. Instead, they moved with lethal, coordinated precision. Reaching beneath their tailored jackets, they drew heavy dark sidearms, while pulling thick metal badges from their inner pockets, letting them dangle from heavy chains around their necks. They weren't cartel representatives. They were deep-cover federal agents. The lead undercover officer, a broad-shouldered man with sharp eyes, stepped over the head table and walked straight toward the stage steps. His weapon was pointed safely toward the floor, but his posture radiated absolute authority. Edward stumbled backward, completely stunned by the unfolding before him. The waiver contract slipped slightly in his sweaty hands. He looked at the armed agents, then at Diana crying on the floor, and finally brought his eyes back to me. His sharp, calculating mind had completely short-circuited. He couldn't comprehend how his flawless, insulated criminal enterprise was being dismantled by the federal government right in the middle of his own celebration. Leaving the crystal podium, I walked slowly across the stage until I stood just inches away from my trembling brother. Looking down at him, I let 12 years of suppressed rage and righteous justice settle into my steady gaze. The warm smile on my face vanished, replaced by an intense, cold calculation that made him instinctively flinch backward. Did you really think I sat in a concrete cell for 12 years doing absolutely nothing, Edward? I asked, my voice low, yet carrying devastating weight. Did you think I spent 4,000 days staring at walls just to let you steal my life and poison my tea? You severely underestimated my patience. For the past 4 years, I wasn't just a ruined inmate. I was a high-level confidential informant for the FBI. Edward let out a suffocating gasp. His eyes went wide, filled with tears. He shook his head weakly, unable to form a coherent word. We knew about your cartel laundering network, I continued relentlessly, making sure he understood the full scope of his defeat. We tracked every offshore account, every shell company, and every illegal wire transfer you executed, using my forged signature. But federal prosecutors faced a major hurdle. Because you hid so carefully behind my name, they couldn't legally prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you were the sole architect of the enterprise. They needed you to step out of my shadow. They needed you to willingly and publicly claim total, undeniable ownership of those tainted assets. We just needed you to formally claim sole ownership of the illegal assets to bypass those complex corporate protection laws. That thick stack of papers you're holding on to isn't your ticket to freedom, I whispered, taking a step back. It's your signed, verified confession. The tall undercover officer walked up the short flight of steps, stepping onto the stage with purpose. It was Agent Mitchell, the lead financial investigator, who had worked alongside me in secret for 4 years. Holstering his weapon, he stood directly in front of my brother. Edward was shaking so violently, his knees looked ready to buckle. His arrogant posture had completely collapsed, leaving behind a terrified shell of a man. Agent Mitchell reached out and firmly pulled the signed waiver right out of Edward's weak, trembling hand. Flipping through the crisp pages, his eyes scanned the perfectly executed signatures I had provided just minutes earlier. My son Sukmi. He snapped the folder shut, with a sharp, decisive sound that echoed across the quiet stage, looking at Edward with pure professional disdain. Thank you for documenting your sole responsibility for the cartel's debts, Agent Mitchell said coldly, unholstering a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. You just made our toughest job remarkably easy tonight. You're done, Edward. The entire criminal syndicate you spent 12 years building is going to be taken apart piece by piece, and you're going to spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal cell. The reality of those words hit Edward with crushing force. He froze on the brightly lit stage, staring at the cold handcuffs dangling from the agent's hand. He began to hyperventilate, taking short, frantic breaths as his empire collapsed around him. The sophisticated corporate titan was gone, replaced by a desperate animal trapped in a cage. He shook his head violently, sweat flying off his forehead and splashing onto the crystal podium. Looking wildly past Agent Mitchell, He locked his panic-stricken eyes onto the undercover cartel agents standing at the base of the stage steps. "Wait," Edward screamed, his voice rising to a sharp, panicked wail. "You don't understand. We can still fix this. The company still owns all the original patents. We still own the foundational source code that drives the entire global infrastructure." He stumbled forward a step, holding his hands out in a pathetic gesture of pleading toward the men he thought were his partners. "I can sell the patents tomorrow morning," Edward begged desperately, his words tripping over each other in his haste. "I can liquidate the intellectual property. I can repay your losses. I still own the technology. I still control the most valuable software algorithm. In the industry, we can settle all the debts. You just have to give me 24 hours to find a buyer." I stood motionless, watching my brother humiliate himself in front of federal agents and the fleeing corporate elite. I let him burn through his last shred of false hope. As his frantic pleading trailed off into heavy breathing, I took a slow, deliberate step forward, stepping past Agent Mitchell, to place myself directly between the federal authorities and my own blood. Would me with wide, unhinged eyes, silently begging for a lifeline he didn't deserve. Reaching into the breast pocket of my oversized tuxedo jacket, my fingers bypassed the silver pen and wrapped around a second legal document I had carried with me all night. I slowly pulled out a crisp sheet of ivory parchment, unfolding it with agonizing slowness under the glare of the spotlights. "No, Edward," I said, my voice dropping to a deep, resonant pitch that demanded absolute quiet in the hall. "No, you don't." Edward stared at the folded paper, his bloodshot eyes darting wildly between my calm face and the document in my hands. He swallowed hard, his throat moving nervously against his tight collar. "What is that?" he asked hoarsely, the false bravado entirely drained from his trembling voice. "This is the final consequence of underestimating your older brother," I answered smoothly. 13 years ago, long before federal investigators raided our office, and before you forged my digital signature to frame me for your early crimes, I noticed disturbing discrepancies in our accounting ledgers. I didn't know what you were planning back then, but my instincts told me to protect the foundation of my life's work. I refused to leave my greatest creation exposed to anyone, not even my own family. So, I took a covert precaution. Taking another step closer, I narrowed the distance between us until I could see my small reflection in his terrified eyes. I quietly transferred the exclusive copyrights and every foundational software patent for our core algorithm completely out of Caldwell Tech. I reassigned total ownership to a completely anonymous holding company registered under the name Aegis Systems. I am the sole owner of that holding company, and I always have been. Edward's jaw dropped open. His head shook rapidly, unable to process the sheer scale of the move. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice faint. "Caldwell Tech ran that software every single day for the last 12 years. We built the entire cartel laundering network on top of that specific algorithm. How could we use it if we didn't own it?" "Because you were renting it," I explained with cold, surgical precision. Caldwell Tech never actually owned the proprietary software that made the company valuable. The business merely licensed it from Aegis Systems under strict terms that explicitly prohibited any illegal financial activity. Because you breached those operational terms by laundering millions of dollars in cartel funds, I exercised my legal right as the sole owner of Aegis Systems to formally terminate the license agreement yesterday morning. The dead silence that settled over the ballroom was heavy enough to crush a man. Edward swayed unsteadily, the color completely leaving his face until his skin looked like pale ash. The terrifying reality of his situation finally breached his thick layer of denial. He was beginning to realize the full, devastating architecture of the trap I had built alongside federal authorities over the past 4 years. I walked straight over to Edward, looking down at his trembling frame to make sure he felt the full, crushing weight of what was coming. 12 years ago, you didn't steal a $50 million tech company, I said directly, my voice completely devoid of mercy. You stole an empty shell. And over the next decade, you filled that empty shell with over $100 million in toxic, illegal cartel debt. You thought you were a mastermind. You thought you were using my legacy to build an untouchable empire. But all you were doing was piling up dynamite right at your own feet. I pointed to the signed waiver contract resting in Agent Mitchell's hands. The greatest tragedy of your greed is that you were so desperate to secure your stolen wealth tonight. You were so terrified I'd try to reclaim my share that you forced me to sign away my rights. You demanded that I sever myself from Caldwell Tech in front of witnesses, leaving you as the sole owner of the entire corporate entity. You just voluntarily signed a legally binding document making yourself, personally, responsible for every single cent of that $100 million in cartel debt. Edward made a sound somewhere between a sob and a scream. His legs finally gave out, and he collapsed onto his knees with a hard thud against the stage, throwing his shaking hands over his face. He tore at his hair as his mind completely broke under the crushing reality. He was going to spend the rest of his life in federal prison, and he owed $100 million to the most dangerous men on the planet. He had zero leverage, no assets, and nowhere left to run. The grand empire he thought he had stolen from me was nothing more than a toxic, carefully constructed illusion. Standing over his weeping, broken body, watching his entire life turn to dust, a profound sense of absolute closure washed over my soul. The crushing weight of total defeat settled over Edward like a suffocating shroud. He remained on his knees, his tailored tuxedo soaked in sweat. The horrifying certainty of his reality sank in. He hadn't just lost a $50 million company. He was going to spend the rest of his life in a maximum security federal prison. By signing that document, he had made himself personally liable for a $100 million illegal debt to an international cartel. Ruthless people who would hunt him down no matter where he went. He had painted a massive permanent target on his own back. I watched his chest heave as he desperately tried to pull air into his panicked lungs. His calculating mind was completely fried. His bloodshot eyes locked onto mine. I stood above him, steady, tall, and unyielding. I didn't offer a single grain of pity. I simply watched him drown in the sea of desperation, the exact same sea he had cold-heartedly thrown me into. Then, Edward's suffocating panic twisted into something else entirely. The fear in his eyes hardened into blind, animalistic rage. He realized that every single painful consequence he was about to face stemmed directly from my silent, patient planning. With a guttural roar ripped from the back of his throat, Edward lunged upward. He threw his entire body weight at me, wildly trying to get his fingers around my neck. He didn't care about the flashing camera lights or the armed tactical team. He just wanted to destroy the man who had outsmarted him. But he never even got close. Before I could even adjust my stance, two heavily armed, federal agents intercepted him with brutal efficiency. One agent drove his shoulder straight into Edward's chest, knocking him completely off his feet and sending him flying backward. The second agent grabbed his flailing arm, wrenching it hard behind his back. Edward hit the polished wooden stage with a heavy thud, the impact forcing a loud gasp of air from his lungs. The agents didn't hesitate. Pressing their heavy knees into his back, they pinned him flat to the floor. Edward thrashed frantically, screaming incoherent curses and violent threats, his face twisted into a mask of pure madness. The steel handcuffs snapped shut tightly around his wrists with a cold metallic click. Immobilized, his face pressed humiliatingly against the floor. Gasping and foaming at the mouth, the reality of his captivity finally settled in. As the agents dragged my screaming brother toward the exit, a sudden movement caught my attention. Diana was still curled up near the edge of the stage. Her expensive silk dress tangled around her shaking legs. The elegant, sophisticated socialite who had casually poured poison into my tea just 24 hours ago was completely gone. In her place sat a terrified, sobbing coward. Seeing her partner in crime dragged away in chains, she realized her protective shield had completely evaporated. The federal authorities were never going to let her walk out of that room. She was an active accomplice, a perjurer, and an attempted murderer. Her glamorous, stolen life was over. Diana scrambled forward on her hands and knees, ignoring the sharp pain of her bare skin scraping against the hard wooden stage. Crawling frantically across the floor, she reached my feet and threw her arms around the fabric of my black trousers. Her makeup was completely ruined, dark trails of mascara running down her pale cheeks. Looking up at me, her eyes were wide with pathetic, fake desperation. She held onto my legs tightly, digging her manicured nails into the fabric as if I were a piece of floating debris in a raging storms. "Richard, please," Diana wailed, her sharp voice piercing through the ambient noise in the room. "You have to listen to me. He made me do it." Edward forced me to lie in court. He threatened to ruin me if I didn't take the stand and follow that script against you. He manipulated my mind when I was vulnerable and scared. I never wanted to hurt you. I was just trying to survive his abuse. Please, Richard. You know who I really am. I never stopped caring about you. I still love you. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was attempting to use the exact same manipulation tactics she had used 12 years ago to steal my life. She actually believed she could shed a few tears, play the role of a helpless, coerced victim, and convince me to protect her from federal prosecutors. She thought my heart was still soft enough to forgive her ultimate betrayal. I didn't move away. I just stood tall as a statue, looking down at her tear-stained face with absolute, unyielding disgust. I felt zero sorrow for the woman crying at my feet. I held no nostalgia for the memories we once shared. She was nothing more than a toxic parasite that had fed on my success and plotted to destroy my mind. Reaching my right hand deep into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, my fingers bypassed the silver pen and wrapped around a small, cylindrical glass object. I slowly pulled my hand out, revealing a tiny glass vial sealed with a black rubber stopper. Inside the clear glass was a fine, pale yellow powder. It was the exact neurotoxic chemical she had carefully crushed and dissolved into my chamomile tea every single night. Earlier that afternoon, while she was busy getting her hair done for the gala, I had managed to locate her remaining supply. I held the small vial high under the bright spotlights, making sure she could see exactly what it was. The moment Diana recognized the container, her desperate sobbing stopped dead. Her eyes widened in pure, paralyzing horror. Her mouth hung open, but no sound came out. She realized I knew everything. I knew about the forged documents, the offshore accounts, and her slow, deliberate attempt on my life. I loosened my fingers and let the vial drop. It fell through the air, landing perfectly right in the center of her lap, resting against the expensive silk of her designer gown. "Tell it to the judge, Diana," I said, my voice cold, flat, and completely devoid of human warmth. "Enjoy the prison food." Stepping back firmly, I pulled my pant leg completely out of her desperate grip. 2 female federal agents immediately stepped forward, grabbing Diana's arms and roughly hauling her up off the floor. She began to scream, a high-pitched, agonizing sound of pure terror and total defeat. Kicking and thrashing, she screamed my name over and over. The agents dragged her off the stage and out of the grand ballroom, leaving me standing alone in the absolute silence of my victory. The grand ballroom, once a shining symbol of my brother's stolen triumph, was now an active, chaotic crime scene. The flashing cameras were quickly controlled by the tactical team, though enough explosive footage had already been captured to dominate global news headlines for months. Standing near the clear crystal podium, a profound sense of pure, absolute peace washed over me as I watched the dramatic aftermath unfold. Agent Mitchell walked over, his heavy tactical boots, crunching loudly on the shattered glass and scattered champagne flutes, covering the floor. Removing his helmet, he offered me a firm, deeply respectful hand. I shook it, feeling the solid grip of a man who understood every sacrifice we had made to reach this moment. Looking me straight in the eye, he delivered the words I had waited 4,000 painful days and nights to hear. "The Department of Justice has fully processed the paperwork," Agent Mitchell said, his voice carrying a quiet yet undeniable weight over the surrounding noise. "Your exoneration is officially complete, Richard. A federal judge signed the administrative order this morning. Every single fraud charge on your record has been wiped clean. You are no longer a felon. You are a free man with a completely clear name." I closed my eyes, letting the gravity of his words wash over my weary soul. The invisible, suffocating chain that had bound my wrists for 12 long years shattered into dust. Taking a deep, steady breath, I opened my eyes to see Harrison walking up onto the lit stage with a confident stride. My fiercely loyal attorney no longer looked like a struggling paralegal. Standing tall, he radiated the sharp, brilliant legal mind that Edward had tried so hard to destroy years ago. Harrison reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a familiar, gleaming object. My father's vintage gold watch. He had personally retrieved it from Edward's wrist during the arrest. Harrison held the gold watch out to me, a silent, powerful proof of our shared victory. Taking the watch, I felt the cool, heavy metal settle solidly into my palm. It was more than an expensive piece of jewelry. It was the physical manifestation of my family's true legacy, finally cleansed of my brother's greedy betrayal. I slowly wrapped the worn leather strap around my wrist and buckled it tight. The familiar, comforting weight against my skin felt like my own soul returning home. Turning my attention back to the remaining guests in the vast room, the stunned members of Caldwell Tech's board of directors hovered near flipped-over tables. They looked at me with a deep mix of guilt and paralyzing fear. They knew they had abandoned me, and they knew their professional fates were now entirely in my hands. I stepped up to the microphone one last time. My voice echoed clearly through the quiet, heavily guarded room. demanding everyone's complete attention. Caldwell Tech is officially dead, I announced, delivering the final corporate verdict without a hint of hesitation or regret. The company you all knew and profited from was nothing more than a corrupt shell. By tomorrow morning, it will be fully liquidated by the federal government to pay off the illegal debts my brother accumulated. But the core technology, proprietary algorithms, and true vision behind this empire belong entirely to Aegis Systems. I paused deliberately, letting my sharp gaze sweep across the corporate executives who had once betrayed me. Aegis Systems launches formally tomorrow morning, I continued smoothly. We will operate on a completely clean slate with unshakable integrity. We are actively hiring, but we will be extremely selective about who we bring into our new home. I am proud to announce that Harrison Wright will immediately serve as my Chief Operating Officer. Harrison stood proudly beside me, nodding firmly to the crowd, officially reclaiming his rightful place at the absolute top of the corporate world. Stepping down from the grand stage, I left the shattered ruins of my brother's criminal empire behind. I walked across the polished marble floor toward the heavy brass exit doors. I didn't lean on a wooden cane. I didn't shuffle my feet, and my shoulders didn't slouch. I walked with a strong, unyielding stride, like a man who had just conquered his darkest demons. Pushing open the heavy doors, I stepped out into the crisp, cool New York night air. The city lights sparkled brilliantly against the dark sky, welcoming me back to the world of the living. Fast forward 6 full months. I stood quietly in front of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my newly renovated Manhattan penthouse office, looking out over the grand city skyline. Morning sunlight cast a brilliant golden glow over the city, illuminating the bustling streets below. It was a breathtaking view, one I had dreamed of during my darkest days in that small concrete cell. The air in the office smelled of fine mahogany and fresh espresso, a stark contrast to the sterile, suffocating smell of prison I had endured for 12 long years. I could still remember the sharp metallic clank of the iron doors shutting behind me, locking me away from the world I had built. Now, those doors were open forever. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the profound sense of absolute freedom fill my lungs. The transition from a ruined, forgotten inmate to the undisputed owner of a thriving tech empire was nothing short of extraordinary. But it wasn't born out of luck. It was the direct result of unshakable patience, careful strategy, and a relentless pursuit of ultimate justice. Turning away from the window, I walked over to my custom desk. The smooth surface was completely clear, except for a few neatly arranged legal documents sitting right in the center. Those thick files contained the final, definitive chapters of the nightmare my family had forced upon me. Placing my hand flat on the cool leather binder, a deep sense of relief radiated through my fingertips. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a clear horizon. The federal trials ended swiftly and without mercy. Faced with the mountain of digital evidence we had gathered, combined with my detailed first-hand testimony, the prosecution's case was completely bulletproof. Edward and Diana desperately turned on each other in the crowded courtroom. Pointing fingers, they traded vicious accusations in a pathetic attempt to save themselves. But the federal judge saw right through their cowardly manipulation. Both were convicted on multiple counts of severe corporate fraud, international money laundering, and grand perjury. I attended their final sentencing hearing just to watch the judge bring the heavy wooden gavel down. Edward looked completely broken. His arrogant posture was replaced by a permanent tremor and a stoop. realizing he would never wear a tailored suit or command a boardroom again. Diana wept hysterically in court, burying her face in her handcuffed hands, begging for leniency. Yet she had never shown a shred of mercy when coldly plotting my destruction. Both were sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security federal prison, with zero possibility of early parole. They will spend their final years in a concrete cage, experiencing the exact same suffocating isolation they had so willingly designed for me. The massive international cartel assets they managed were systematically seized and dismantled by a joint federal task force. Their illegal network was erased, leaving them with nothing but the heavy weight of their own massive regret. The millions they had stolen vanished. They learned the hardest way possible. Building a life on lies guarantees a spectacular collapse when the foundation turns to dust. Meanwhile, Aegis Systems' revolutionary new logistics software officially launched to an unprecedented global response. The clean, unburdened company is thriving beyond my wildest expectations. Free from the toxic weight of my brother's criminal enterprise, our proprietary algorithms have completely transformed global supply chains. In just a few short months, the successful launch effectively tripled my original net worth. The market recognized our absolute integrity, and our corporate momentum is unstoppable. The heavy oak office door opened with a soft click. Harrison walked in, looking sharp and confident in his role as Chief Operating Officer. He was carrying 2 heavy crystal glasses and an unopened bottle of rare 18-year bourbon. Walking over to the small bar beside my desk, he uncorked the dark bottle and poured the rich amber liquid. Handing me a glass, a proud, knowing smile touched his face. Standing side by side in the quiet elegance of the penthouse, we raised our glasses in a silent, meaningful toast to unshakable patience, careful strategy, and the absolute certainty of karma. I took a slow sip of the smooth bourbon, feeling its comforting warmth spread through my chest, and turned back to the city skyline. The 12 painful years I lost in that concrete cell can never be brought back. But standing here in the sunlight, I realized those years weren't wasted. They forged me into a sharp instrument, fully capable of cutting away the toxic greed from my life. Finally, after a decade in the dark, I am truly free. Trust is the most valuable currency a man can possess, but blind trust is the fastest path to total destruction. When you spend a lifetime building a meaningful legacy, you must always be ready to protect it, even from those standing closest to you. The most devastating betrayals rarely come from known enemies. They almost always come from the people smiling warmly at your dinner table, claiming to love you while plotting your downfall in secret. Time is the ultimate judge and the ultimate truth teller. It might take a day, or it might take 12 painful years, but the truth inevitably surfaces and shatters the darkest lies. Never let severe hardship or deep injustice break your spirit. Instead, let the heavy pressure of those trials forge you into someone completely indestructible. True justice is rarely swift and almost never easy, but it demands absolute, unshakable patience. If you stay focused, keep your mind sharp, and refuse to surrender to despair, you will eventually find the perfect moment to strike back. You must become the silent storm, one your enemies never see, coming until it's far too late to run. If my story of surviving deep betrayal and finding for ultimate justice resonated with you today, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me If you've ever had to stand up against those who severely undervalued your worth. I read every single comment, and your incredible support means the world to me. Share this video with anyone who might need a reminder that they are strong enough to overcome their darkest days. Stay sharp, always trust your deepest instincts, and never stop fighting for the life you deserve. Thank you so much for listening.